The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Where do we get our energy?
Increasingly from the wind, from waves, from hot rocks, from what's renewable.
That's what you'd think, but the UK government now says there will be annual contracts to drill for oil and gas in the North Sea. And globally, we're using more fossil fuels than ever before.
The commitments to net zero are being watered down. It's too difficult and burdensome, we're told, to move so fast against carbon emissions.
So is it simply realism? Should the UK use the resources it still has in a costly energy market?
Or is it important to set hard and inconvenient targets to save our future?
The Y Curve.
I feel like we have been sold a pup by the Prime Minister out of all of this. So the things that he said that, by offering more licenses, I don't know how long it takes.
This is North Sea oil,
and gas. The time it takes from issuing a new license to actually getting it deployed. How many years is that going to take at a time when we are trying to reduce our reliance on these fossil fuels?
And the evidence that we actually get any specific benefit from the North Sea is a bit marginal.
Exactly. Do we benefit from it? Because it's an international price, obviously, that's paid. And also energy security was the other reason he gave. And, I understand it. We're getting a lot of stuff from Norway.
Doesn't sound like it's going to work either. But in terms of his general position that, we can't go as fast towards net zero as perhaps we wanted to, because the cost for individual families and people trying to afford to run cars or their heating is rather heavy. And I mean, in that sense, I think he may have an appeal to the voters on this one.
Yeah, so a misinformed voter, maybe. Because is it really going to bring the prices down? So there's a lot to talk about anyway.
Let's bring in Gavin Bridge, who's Professor of Economic Geography at Durham University and Fellow of the Durham Energy Institute.
So, Gavin, do we actually need to do this? Do we actually need to go and get more oil domestically? Because, we haven't been self-sufficient with oil for a long time. And in any case, irrespective of where the oil comes from, we're only ever going to be a small percentage of the total. And it's an international marketplace. So is getting, more North Sea oil actually going to make any difference, for example, to the price we pay or to energy security?
So there's many elements to your question there.
Actually, all the questions for the half-hour programme I've just done in the first question.
I'm just going to say nothing from now.
So maybe what we could do, we could unpack those bit by bit. The relationship between the offshore, from where the UK extracts oil, and the onshore, where the UK consumes oil, is a really interesting question, because I think in most people's minds, we will know we've got North Sea oil. We've had North Sea oil from the mid-1970s. And the reasonable assumption would be that we produce oil offshore and we consume it onshore. And what's actually quite surprising to most people is that most of the oil that is produced in the North Sea and the UK continental shelf is exported. 80% of that oil is exported. So most of it doesn't touch the sides of the UK, goes straight into international markets. Now, the UK does consume plenty of oil. It's down from its peak in the 1970s, down substantially from that peak, but it's still a major consumer of oil and oil products, principally for transport. But most of that is based on imports. Whether that is...
So just to clarify that, Gavin, what you're saying is the oil that we get from the North Sea isn't suitable, or it has to be processed elsewhere? Why is it not used straight away?
So that kind of mismatch, if you like, these two systems that barely meet, or meet in only a very limited way, requires some explanation. And the short answer is there are several factors. So let me try and explain them. A key element here is a little bit of history, in that most of the refineries in the UK were set up in a period before North Sea oil. So most of those refineries, they've obviously been expanded and updated over time, but they date from the 1950s and the 1960s, when the UK saw a really significant increase in demand for fuels. This was the beginning of the jet age, most people beginning to own cars, drive around, motorways being built. So basically demand for petroleum boomed. And in that period, refineries were set up that were based on importing crude from elsewhere. But the offshore crude in the North Sea is of a particular quality. It's often referred to as being premium crudes. In other words, it can command a price premium in international markets. And it's also, most of it is produced in a way that means it's readily put on a ship. And if you put a crude on a ship, it's easily transported. It can go into international markets to wherever the price is best. And because of that, most of the crude from the North Sea has ended up being sold directly in international markets. Some of them
So the refineries that we had then, just so I understand, the refineries that we had then were for the wrong type of oil. We couldn't refine and then export, or refine and then use, because the refineries were set up largely for imports.
Yeah. So what you've got is a type of crude offshore that, if you like, faces international markets. It can get a premium on international markets. And then you've got refineries in the UK that are trying to meet UK demand. And a lot of UK demand is for what's called the middle distillates. So that would be things like diesel, for example. And to produce diesel, you need a blend of different crudes. And broadly speaking, the sort of crudes you need for that are not really produced offshore.
Okay, so just to clarify and walk us through, because this is a complicated area. Yeah. When it goes into the international markets, nonetheless, there is, I guess, a tax benefit. The benefit to the UK of getting North Sea oil is that the government gets a take along the way. So it does earn something for the UK economy.
So it'll earn something in terms of a tax take, yes. And there will be a contribution to the balance of payments. It's basically exporting a fuel which will be sold in dollars, and that will contribute to the overall balance of payments.
Right. But net, we're now importing. I mean, there was a time, wasn't there, when we were actually exporting more than we were using, but those days are long gone. So now it's a negative balance of payment because we're importing more than we're exporting.
So we are a net importer overall. That is right.
Okay, so we've got to the stage where we can say about this that getting it out of the ground in the North Sea does have a benefit for the UK economy, but it would be wrong to say that we actually use what's coming out of there in any direct sense.
And should we be targeting being a net exporter again, or is that just a pipe dream, if you'll excuse the pun?
I think those prospects are really limited by the nature of the North Sea as a basin. It's widely regarded as a mature and declining, those are the two words, mature and declining basin, in the sense that the really large reserves are in the basin's history. They're in the rear view mirror, and that the prospects of a sustained increase in production that would shift the dial in terms of treasury take and balance of payments, that's a very unlikely to happen.
So it's going to be too expensive, in other words, if we sold on the international markets, the cost of extracting. Because I'm looking at some figures this is from a while ago, from 2015. The cost of producing 1 barrel of oil in the UK was $52.50. Dollars compared to $8.50 in Kuwait and $9.90 in Saudi Arabia. Now you're saying we're sort of like a slightly more premium product, but a chunk of that presumably is just the fact that it just jumps out of the ground in Saudi Arabia and we're having to work hard to extract it.
Yeah, so what you're looking at there would be a comparison of production costs, and the UK as a mature and declining basin has, compared certainly to the Middle East, significantly higher production costs. It's not.
So if we offered more licenses, who'd want them?
Well, exactly, because big companies are not going to grab it if the upstream costs are as high as they are.
Yeah, so we've been doing some work, some research funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And through that work, we've been looking at who is acquiring licenses in the North Sea. And it's very clear there's a sort of transition in ownership in the offshore in the last 20 years. So basically since the peak of production, which for oil was 1999, for gas 2000. And in the last 23 years or so, there's been a significant shift. Some of the companies that have been synonymous with the North Sea for much of its period, companies like Chevron and Exxon, BP, Shell, some of those companies have exited. Chevron and Exxon would be examples of that. Others, like Shell and BP, have really reprofiled their production. They've sold off a bunch of assets, in other words. And in their place, a range of other companies have come into the basin. It's quite an interesting mix. Some of those are not household names. They tend to be focused on oil and gas production rather than being integrated companies with downstream refining arms. So a company like Harbour Energy, for example, or NEO. Some of them are backed by private equity, and others are state-owned firms, not UK state-owned firms, but state-owned firms from outside the UK.
But it's still worth their while. They're clearly making an economic judgment. You think with these licenses, the annual licenses, there will be a take-up?
The King's Speech announcement for annual licensing rounds, the North Sea Transition Authority has already the capacity to issue licenses. It can do that at a timing that it chooses. So the upping the ante, if you like, to push this to an annual round is primarily, I think, a domestic political objective in terms of party politics ahead of a general election.
It's meaningless, really, in terms of actual production and cost and everything else.
It's spin, isn't it, is what you're saying. It's something that exists already.
The classic political thing of re-announcing what was already there.
Well, the process for issuing licenses to the UK continental shelf already exists. What's being proposed here is annualizing that process, a yearly process. In practice, the last round, the 33rd licensing round, has taken over a year from the opening of that round to licenses being issued. So in practice, it takes a year to see this process through. So actually, the concrete consequence of annualizing it in terms of an increase in uptake, I think that's really unlikely to occur.
And then I'm curious about those companies which are not the household names, as you say, some foreign state enterprises who are buying up these licenses. If they're just not commercially viable for the big players, how are they hoping to make some money out of it?
Some of the companies that are coming in and buying up those licenses have they're focused on cutting costs. So they will look to do that often by outsourcing parts of the production process to some of the supply chain companies in the supply chain. Some of them are smaller in terms of their overall production profile. And that means that they don't need to seek large reserves that the really big companies need for replacement. So there's a bit of a sort of an interesting ecology, if you like, between large firms that need large reserves to replace what they produce every year, and then smaller firms that don't, if you like, have to generate the reserves replacement at the same level, who can come into a basin and they find value for their shareholders in the smaller reserves that are left.
Right, so we're talking about small amounts of energy being produced then in terms of the total supply in the world. This is just a mere blip.
And we haven't really mentioned the gas element. You mentioned the gas briefly there. You said the oil isn't really the kind that we can immediately use here. What about the gas? Is that an opening?
Yeah, so the gas is the gas production in the North Sea is physically connected to the UK. It comes into the UK and supplies a little under half of domestic consumption, and the difference is made up with imports. Those imports, some of them come by pipeline, principally from Norway. Increasingly, they're coming in the form of liquefied natural gas, gas that's been turned into a liquid by chilling it. And that's coming in from the US, from Norway, and from further afield too, from Qatar. So gas offshore is physically connected and consumed in the UK. There is actually quite a bit of gas export. There are some interconnectors with Europe. And in the last year, which saw an increase of gas demand in Europe, particularly because of the cut-off of Russian supplies, the UK has been acting as a kind of a bridgehead, importing LNG and then exporting that gas through the pipelines into Europe.
So, and there's no price advantage. Again, it would just be the fact that it comes from the North Sea and it comes in and we use it. Is there a price advantage to UK consumers, or again, is it, we're paying an international market price?
So this is a key point. So the proposition that if we issue more licenses and we drill for more oil and gas, that will have a consequence for the consumer, that it would deliver lower prices. That isn't the case. We have been producing oil and gas in the offshore during a period of high international oil prices, and it hasn't insulated the UK from those high prices, as we're all aware. And the reason for that is that even though we might produce it domestically, produce the gas from UK waters, that gas is bought and sold at international market prices. We're not insulated from that. So that the best way of addressing questions of affordability for UK consumers is to move away from a reliance on gas, whether that gas is imported through pipelines or LNG, or whether it's produced domestically. The most effective way of reducing exposure to volatile prices is to reduce consumption of fossil fuels. So improve energy efficiency and shift to renewables.
That kind of brings us, to the point where we're saying, okay, we can see some economic advantage to the continued prospecting for oil and gas. Nothing major, but it's in terms of perhaps tax take.
I think that's key here. We're talking.
We get a bit of extra tax. Is all.
But what we haven't mentioned at all.
We might not get a little extra tax.
Because why not?
Well, because of the way the tax system works for offshore. Quite a lot of the upfront costs, the decommissioning costs, can be written off against that tax. So in the last few years, the kind of tax take has actually been negative in relation to the offshore.
Even with the windfall tax that was put in place.
The windfall tax has shifted that a little bit. But what the windfall tax has effectively done to the tax rate in the UK offshore has put it up to a level where it is still relatively attractive by international terms. So it's put it up from around 40% up to around 60, 68, 70%, something like that as a total tax take, which is equivalent to many other oil and gas basins around the world. And important to say, there are really significant exemptions that are written into the windfall tax energy profits levy that mean that for many companies that additional tax of the windfall is avoided.
And what we haven't mentioned anywhere along the way is the balance of what we've said is, let's say, marginal financial advantage against the huge cost in climate terms of continuing to use and produce fossil fuels. And that's a much harder thing to balance, isn't it?
I'm really glad you've brought that up, because that really is, along with the question of affordability and exposure to volatile prices linked to oil and gas, that climate consideration is something that needs to be front and center here. And the Climate Change Committee here has been absolutely crystal clear on that. They've explicitly said that in their report on net zero in June this year, explicitly said that the expansion of fossil fuels is not in line with a net zero scenario. This is maps well onto international scientific evidence in this space that suggests that 60% of oil and gas reserves that are already known need to stay in the ground to stand any chance of delivering a 1.5 degree C, staying within a 1.5 degree C rise in temperature. And a report, the net zero scenario from the International Energy Agency, which made it clear that no new oil and gas fields are needed in the context of a net zero scenario.
But that's a key point, is it? No new.
Because I'm looking at an IEA report, they're forecasting that right up to 2050, the world is going to stick at using around 100 million barrels a day. So we'll see a fall in advanced economies, but that's going to be basically completely replaced by increased demand from other emerging markets. So that doesn't sound like a net zero situation at all. That sounds like we're just going to carry on where we are right now.
Well, IEA is forecasting a global peak in demand by 2030 now. So the global peak in demand is within sight. But a key point is it's the speed of the downslope. So peaking alone is not enough to stay any chance within a 1.5 degree C. There has to be a really significant markdown in the consumption of fossil fuels. And it's increasingly clear that supply side policies are going to be part of that. And this is something that the Climate Change Committee in the UK context has made clear. They support for restrictions on supply in the interests of achieving climate targets.
So that would be legal rules, if you like, on what supply can be. It would be effectively a reduced how much you can get out of the ground kind of thing.
Well, what it would be first of all, would be not issuing new licenses for oil and gas. And to some extent, the licensing question is a bit of a red herring. And I can explain this by saying that a lot of the North Sea, a lot of the UK continental shelf is already licensed. So you may have heard of the recent decision, the Rosebank decision. Rosebank is
there was a key new thing that was licensed with great controversy.
Well, no, this is sorry to correct you, but it is important.
Happens all the time. Yeah, I get used to it.
So the decision on Rosebank was a decision by the NSTA, the North Sea Transition Authority, what used to be called the Oil and Gas Authority, the regulator, and the decision was not a licensing decision. And the reason I'm being pedantic about this is that licensing is separate to the approval process, or what's called a consenting process. And the reason that's significant is that a lot of the North Sea is already licensed. So Rosebank was licensed back in the early 2000s, and the decision earlier this year was an approval by the NSTA. So what that distinction is pointing us to is that a key space here in terms of how much more oil and gas will be produced in the North Sea is not about licensing. It's about the approval process of areas that are already licensed.
Right. But we are a big player in this, though, aren't we? I mean, we're not producing as much. I think I saw somewhere that we've got, 800,000 barrels a day. It's a lot in the UK. It was over 1 million just before the pandemic, but in the 80s and 90s, it was 2 million. But I think, somewhere around 90 million barrels a day are produced globally. So we're a small part of that, aren't we? And if we're looking at how you constrain supply, I mean, surely it's not us that's going to be the risk. It's going to be obviously the Middle East, but also the US, where shale oil is produced almost within weeks. The moment the price comes down, shale oil production in the US the moment the price goes up, shale oil production in the US starts to jump in because just about everyone's figured out they can make some money out of it.
Yeah, this question about what is the UK's role in this is a really interesting one, an important one. So there are some things we can say. So we are a small player in terms of the overall picture, as you've pointed out, in terms of production and in terms of consumption too. But if you look on a European scale, then we're the second largest oil producer in the European space after Norway. The UK's role in the oil and gas sector way outstrips the significance of its offshore production in terms of London's role as a centre for raising oil and gas finance globally, as a place for trading oil and gas. The trading floors, for example, in London are of global significance. And in terms of the companies that are headquartered here, both the household names, BP and Shell, but also companies in the supply chain that see much of their value from investing in oil and gas production and services elsewhere in the world. So the UK has kind of an outsized role in the oil and gas sector compared to its role in global production. There's something else that I think is really important here, and that goes to the question about international signaling, or you might talk about it in terms of international leadership. And I think in the run-up to the COP meeting, the Conference of the Parties in
Dubai,
Dubai and the UAE in November. This
isn't
that
ironic in itself? But we'll put that in parentheses.
Well, So, and this is, what capacity does a country like the UK have for leverage on global climate? And it can make some claims, as our leading politicians do, to climate leadership, the Climate Change Act, the rapid fall in emissions over time. Those are all significant things that do give the UK some leverage.
But then when you make announcements like we had in the King's Speech, for very little benefit, you were saying, in terms of finance, it sends the wrong signal, doesn't it? It makes it difficult to argue that we're a world leader in terms of moving towards net zero.
And that's the point. That's the point I'm making here. The claims to leadership, which can be based on the historic record in this space, are potentially being squandered by continuing to develop oil and gas reserves in the North Sea.
Yeah, but then you've got the corollary to that, which I can kind of hear people screaming at their portable devices that's playing this, is actually, it may be a question of global leadership and us waving the flag and everything else, but it comes down to how much people can afford to pay their heating bills here, how much people can afford to run a car, whether their old car is still functionable, in a ULEZ area.
International market, it makes no difference.
Well, exactly.
It's like if you run a pork pie factory in Bolton, you're not going to get cheaper pork pies in Bolton. They're going to sell pork pies for the same price all over Britain.
The burden is held in the UK people, which in the end, Gavin, is who the politicians are responsible to.
I think the key thing there is that if you are concerned about affordability, which we should be, the best solution to dealing with exposure to volatile and particularly high prices is to move away from a reliance on oil and gas. And the way to do that is not only in the offshore, it's about concerted, rapid and ambitious efforts to reduce dependence on fossil fuels onshore. So it's the stuff of energy efficiency. It's the stuff of more rapid moves away from car dependence. It's going to involve not only a focus on the offshore, but onshore too.
But it's gradual, isn't it? And
those gigs, they say that does take time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's another thing in the short term. And part of the problem I think we hit was that we didn't have the reserves, did we, that other countries had? So Centrica, when they privatized gas, they basically shortly afterwards closed the gas storage that we had in the North Sea. I mean, they had a 30 square kilometre reservoir. It could hold 6 billion cubic feet of gas. And it was closed in 2017 because it was too expensive to maintain without government support. And now I think the government is talking about maybe helping them a little bit, and they're reopening it, but like 2% of the original gas storage, and they're worried that the government's not going to keep their word on it. So isn't that balancing out of demand and supply with greater storage, that would be a more sensible move in the short term, wouldn't it, rather than opening up new gas storage?
Energy security was.
I think the storage question is unfortunately not a short-term issue, and the sort of thing you're proposing there of a large storage facility is not something that can be brought into production very quickly. And this question of the role of physical storage has been looked at quite extensively. And the way the UK has basically handled its gas security over time has been through diversification of supply, particularly through liquefied natural gas, the construction of terminals to receive liquefied gas in South West Wales, on the Thames estuary. And this physical diversification has given the UK a reasonable degree of assurance around physical supplies, but it hasn't insulated the UK from price volatility. So we've had physical security, but not price security. And the key to delivering price security is removing your reliance on a volatile commodity, which in this case is gas.
But yeah, people will say, well, wind is volatile in the sense when the wind doesn't blow, the turbines don't move, and we don't get the supplies of energy we need. A lot of these renewable resources are good, but they're not reliable, at least not yet.
They're reliable in terms of the technology involved. It's the intermittency because of the reliance on physical variables, as you point out, the wind and the sun. So solutions to that are about networking your renewables. The UK now has a submarine cable connecting the UK to hydropower from Norway that comes onshore in Northumberland. For example, and the connectivity of transmission lines to Europe, particularly to France.
Through the Channel Tunnel, I understand, actually. They're using part of the Channel Tunnel to build new cables.
But what you've got there is a connectivity, a transmission system connectivity that allows you to balance off intermittency in different parts of the physical environment. That together with forms of energy storage, whether it's battery storage or other forms of energy storage, electricity storage, give you is the way that you shift your electricity supply towards renewables.
So what you're saying is that the ambitious target of net zero, the idea of moving much faster towards that, which effectively Rishi Sunak has kind of dumped now, and for example with cars, the requirement for cars to be electric in a much earlier point, that you're saying that his claim that is pretty much undoable without major sacrifices by the voting public in terms of reliability of energy source and costs and the rest of it. You're saying you got that wrong, that actually we could go ahead.
So the speed of transition.
Yeah.
So that's, I think Rishi Sunak's trying to say, well, we do want to get there, but it's got to be, the speed of it all was too fast, and we've got to slow down.
It's too painful for the people basically voting for him. Yeah.
But what's interesting there is if you actually ask people what do they want, if you look at the polling, consistently shows strong support for action on climate, that there is a recognition that reliance on fossil fuels subjects the UK to volatile prices, and that the most effective way of addressing that is to move more rapidly away from that dependence, that reliance.
Right. So in summary, what we're saying, what Rishi Sunak has given us the two main reasons why he wanted to open up new fields in the North Sea. One was for energy security, and I think you said, a lot lot of it's coming from Norway. We get stuff from the United States as well.
Pretty comprehensively, that's not true.
It's part, exactly. We're part of an international market, and we buy it where it's available from. So that doesn't apply. And then the other one is that, yes, it's going to bring down costs, and it's not because it's an international marketplace. So there's no, and I would have thought also, I mean, and plus the fact, as you're saying, it's expensive anyway.
And renewables can take it up.
And it would be cheaper to do renewables, and we're not going to get any tax benefits from this either. So everything is promising. There's no, I mean, none of it's true.
So let's take each of those. So if just take the offshore, right? So when the assumption is if you offer licenses more frequently, you will get an uptake of those licenses. They'll be brought into production, and there'll be additional supply. I think at each step of those, there's real questions about that. So you can offer licenses, and there will be companies who seek to acquire a license. But whether they actually turn that license into new oil and gas, there's a lot that has to happen from being issued a license to bringing oil and gas into production.
Yeah. So what sort of like how many years normally would that
be? It varies. So the quickest is probably 3 to 4 years for a associated gas field. So that's in an area where there's already infrastructure, there's already production, and really what you're doing is you're just reaching a little bit further out. So 3 to 4 years. But if you're talking about a major oil field, that's probably going to be somewhere between 5 to 10 years. So from issuing a license to actually seeing some production, that's going to be a significant time delay in that. So you're not going to see any result from this quickly. I think a second cause for kind of skepticism around this is that increasingly, there are concerns about what are called stranded assets, so that if you acquire an oil and gas reserve and you seek to develop it, that actually action on climate change will take some of that market away from you, and you won't be able to sell that at the price you expected. And furthermore, that you won't get the loans. The bank facilities won't lend to you in the way. In other words, the commerciality and the ability to turn a geological reserve into a going concern that produces oil and gas.
So you've just given all the reasons there why it's not going to happen. There's
also the security issue, which is, can we rely without that on renewables? And your answer is basically yes, we can, without too much pain.
So I would say renewables, yes. But more than that, right? It has to also be accompanied with things like energy efficiency and investments in, particularly when it comes to road transport, in a reducing car dependence. So that's things like public transport. It's about the underpinning investments that enable people to move around without being dependent on individual automobility.
Well, you mean like a high-speed rail network up and down the country, that sort of thing?
I mean things that are much more mundane than
That's cruel. That's cruel. Really Gavin's in Durham. It's very cruel to mention north-south.
Well, it was never going to Durham anyway, was it?
There are things that really matter to people's quality of life, which is the ease and cost with which you can move around without being reliant on your own car. And in a relatively densely populated country like the UK, the opportunities for doing that are considerable. They haven't been the target of sustained public and private investments over the last few decades, but there is significant potential there to reduce the demand for transport fuels. In fact,
so you're talking about better public transport, better electric public transport,
or hydrogen, I suppose.
Well, I'm talking about reducing the reliance on individually owned cars. So that could be things like car sharing. It could be things like public transport, bus networks, tram networks, train networks. All those things that mean that people's making their own transport choices are less dependent on owning and using a car.
So are we then saying that out of everything that Rishi Sunak has said, the reasoning, which we've been through a couple of times now, he seems to be wrong on all of them. So is that because he doesn't understand it? He's been badly informed, or
it's just politics?
But if it's politics, it's a curious thing, isn't it? Because as you said, Gavin, nobody's asking for this. Nobody is saying, "I'm going to vote for the government."
Well,
that is
the ULEZ thing famously in the by-election. Came in that the Uxbridge by-election theoretically fell back to the Tories on the ULEZ, when people have votes to put, that certainly the Tories are banking that is going to be an issue.
It was a remarkable leap from that, and a very wafer-thin majority, 500, I think it was, to sort of pivot on the rollback of net zero environmental actions.
So then you find it a bit curious.
So the question about why would you do this? So I think the political logic is to force Labour into a position of being against something, and to try and make a set of arguments. You've rehearsed them admirably of what licensing might do. I think on each of those grounds, affordability, energy security, and climate, the link between offshore licensing and delivering those things is very, very weak, and can be argued against quite clearly. So I think that what's happening here is really a political logic around the next general election. I think there are interests who do want to see a continued oil and gas production. If you have assets in the North Sea, you're interested in seeing the life of those being extended where possible. If you've sunk costs, if you want to see,
for sure,
your ability to return some revenue from those. If you are in the supply sector looking at future contracts, you see this as a business opportunity. So
you want to sweat the assets you've got. Nobody is going to be wanting to establish, as you've said, no one is going to want to invest in new assets because it's too much of a liability.
So I think there's sort of two sorts of risks here. One is the risk that offering more licenses does extend the life of the North Sea, and so you have continued production of more and more marginal reserves. And what that means is that ultimately you end up with a disorderly transition. You end up with companies going bankrupt and having to bail out, and the taxpayer needing to bail those companies out. So instead of an orderly transition and a rapid transition, what you're doing is you're pushing right to the margins, if you like, and then the inevitable reckoning that comes is rapid, sudden, uncontrolled, and produces additional costs that fall on the taxpayer. That's one risk. The second risk is kind of the opportunity cost, if you can put it that way, which is that instead of sending a really clear signal that the UK is committed to the net zero targets and providing assurance to investors on the green and renewable side of the slate, what this does is create some uncertainty. And I think it's really significant. Over the last few months, you've seen business leaders, Aviva, insurance company, you were part of the FTSE 100, coming out very strongly saying that a decision to offer new licenses in the North Sea is the wrong direction of travel, creates uncertainty, and sort of makes it much more difficult for the UK to argue internationally for the sort of action that is needed to address both affordability and climate change.
It does feel, doesn't it, like you've got your foot on the accelerator as you approach a brick wall.
Not a good position to be in. Gavin, I think we've buried the Rishi Sunak case quite comprehensively.
And Keir Starmer, there's your answer for the next election.
We are not a political pushing, but we are.
You haven't asked me about that, because I think the licensing, what Labour's proposing on licensing, is interesting because it is a change in direction from the last 50 years. But as I've said, licensing is a red herring. That's actually not where the action is. It's kind of the very least you should be doing is saying, stop giving out new licensing.
We've run out of time today, but I know they have this idea for a sort of like a consolidated energy authority. We should have asked you about that earlier, because that is interesting, but we'll talk about that some other time.
We will, perhaps when we get nearer to the election, which, after all, they are both aiming for with all these policies anyway.
Yeah.
Gavin, thank you for doing that. Good to talk.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, okay, there wasn't a lot of sense in what Rishi said there, but maybe we'll get more from the Treasurer next week, from the Chancellor.
Treasurer, not the Treasurer, the Chancellor, you bloody Australian.
I corrected myself almost instantaneously.
Anyway, Jeremy Hunt will be standing up and giving a sense of what is to come in terms of, for example, tax cuts, because there's a lot of pressure on him for tax cuts ahead of the election.
He's been saying he's not going to, hasn't he?
Well,
and then they had this crazy idea that for tax cuts they were going to look at inheritance tax, which is sort of like something that affects the top 0.1%
Tory
of the population. But not many of them even. So but what about the tax thresholds which have been frozen? I mean, there's a lot of illogic going on there as well, isn't there? So, but anyway, we'll see.
And we're just a year, of course, from a rather different financial financial statement that that tanked the economy, if you remember,
Yes.
just a year and a bit.
Yeah.
A certain Kwasi Kwarteng achieved a certain something, or didn't, and then Jeremy Hunt came in and turned it all round. So a year on from that debacle, it will be interesting to see where he kind of wants to
supposedly
direct
got
us.
some headroom. He said,
Well,
I always find
find
it
out.
curious, isn't it, when they say we've got headroom because something has come in slightly less expensive than they thought, or they've got more income coming in. They've still got massive debt, so they could actually use that headroom if they wanted to reduce that debt, or spend it on something that's going to win them votes. And
Well, I think I know which way they'll jump, but I'm a terrible old cynic.
but I don't think maybe they won't do it just now. Maybe they'll save it for the big budget just before the election. Best to save up and then hit everyone at once.
And meanwhile, they've got to reassure the international markets that we are not going down the Kwasi Kwarteng route ever again.
Going down the Kwasi Kwarteng. Yeah.
Right.
Is that where Britain is going?
Well,
there's a whole new adjective.
There is, and we won't go there. But next week, we will be talking about this. In fact, we will have the statement, and we will dissect it.
Yeah, we will. Hot off the press next week on the Why Curve. Thanks for listening today.
Bye.
The Why Curve.